Around 1350 BC, Amenhotep IV became the new pharaoh of Egypt, the 10th of the 18th dynasty. During the first few years, things went pretty normally, as Amenhotep followed the traditions established by the pharaohs who came before him. However, in his 5th regnal year, he did something that shocked and outraged the people of Egypt. Amenhotep completely abandoned the old gods and introduced Atenism, a new religion centered around the sole worship of the Aten, the sun disk. In the process of his spiritual revolution, Amenhotep also renounced his old name and became Akhenaten. Determined to go all in on this monumental shift, Akhenaten felt like he needed a change of scenery. The Egyptian capital of Thebes was still heavy with the presence of the old gods, since so many of their temples and priests were there, and thus Akhenaten decided to found a new city, a capital dedicated entirely to the worship of the Aten. He chose a location on the east bank of the Nile River, roughly halfway between Thebes and Memphis, and called that city Akhenaten, meaning the horizon of the Aten, but today it is better known as Amarna. The pharaoh envisioned his new capital to become the pride of Egypt, a grand city seldom seen anywhere else in the world, where everyone was wholeheartedly committed to the glorification of the Aten. This vision never came to fruition. The rest of Egypt was not on board with Akhenaten's heretical ideas, so as soon as he died, the pharaohs who followed reverted to the old ways, and everyone tried to forget that his reign ever happened. As for Amarna, it was abandoned just 17 years after it was founded. But Akhenaten's loss was our gain. Amarna became the best preserved city of that period, with most of its building foundations still in place where they were over 3,300 years ago. It has become a unique time capsule of life in ancient Egypt, and one that we are going to explore today. Welcome back to Geographics. I'm your host, Eric Malachite, and today's script was provided by Radu Alexander, so be sure to show him some love in the comments as you deploy your likes, and do the rest of that stuff that keeps the eldritch beast that is the YouTube algorithm going. Let's get to it. Akhenaten was part of the 18th dynasty, one of the most famous and well-documented dynasties in ancient Egypt, including pharaohs such as Tutankhamun, Hatshepsut, and Thutmose the Great. We have full videos on everyone we just mentioned on our sister channel Biographics, including Akhenaten, so we're not going to delve too deep into his reign as pharaoh. We'll just let Simon do that since I'm pretty sure he's the one that recorded those. Instead, we'll move right along until he founded his new capital. As we mentioned, originally the city was called Akhenaten, although its ruins are now known as Amarna, or Tel Allah Amarna, to give it its official designation. The name comes from the Beni Amran people, the Bedouin tribe that settled in the region a few centuries ago. For the sake of clarity, we'll refer to it as Amarna throughout the video. Construction on the new capital most likely began during Akhenaten's 5th year as a pharaoh, which would have been 1346 BC, following the traditional convention. Egyptologists haven't found any traces of earlier buildings at the site or any signs of a previous occupation, so before Amarna, the location was just a large wide-open plain on the east bank of the Nile River, about 250 kilometers south of modern-day Cairo. It's pretty clear that Akhenaten carefully chose the site for his new capital. The plain was about 8 kilometers long and 5 kilometers wide, with cliffs bordering it at each end of the ground gently sloping towards the river. Valleys to the east of the city further stretched out the site to over 20 kilometers at its longest. By comparison, the city was larger than the previous capital of Thebes, which was one of the biggest cities in history at the time, so the pharaoh had grand ambitions in mind about turning Amarna into one of the most magnificent and imposing human creations that the world had ever seen. However, he never got to see those ambitions fulfilled, and only about a tenth of the space was actually occupied. Construction on the city happened fast. Akhenaten took up residence in Amarna in his 6th regnal year, so at least parts of it were ready by then. Many of the buildings were made out of mud brick to get them done quickly and on a budget, with only the grandest edifices made of stone. Amarna is divided into 3 zones. The outer zone, as it were, consists of a series of giant carved stone tablets known as stelae. They were used by the pharaoh to mark out the limits of the city, but were also inscribed with oaths and publications to inform others of the nature of the holy site they were about to enter. 16 of these boundary stelae have been found so far, most of them by Egyptologist Flinders Petrie back in 1891. He designated them using English capital letters, although he intentionally left gaps in the sequence since he was certain that more would be discovered later. They varied drastically in size and condition, and the biggest ones were carved directly into the cliffs. Stela U, for example, is the biggest one of all, measuring over 7.5 meters from top to bottom and over 4 meters in width. By comparison, Stela L is a small tablet that has weathered away almost completely, with only a few markings still visible on it. A lot of the damage has been caused not by the passage of time, but rather by modern hands. Thieves have cut pieces out of the surface of the stelae to sell them to private collectors. Even more dramatically, about 120 years ago, a group of would-be treasure hunters blew up Stela P using gunpowder, expecting it to be a door hiding a secret chamber full of gold, jewels, and priceless artifacts. You know what the pharaohs were like. On this occasion, though, the thieves were left looking like Geraldo opening Al Capone's vault, because the only thing hiding behind the stelae was more rock. The text on the stelae is pretty long and repetitive, so here it is in its entirety. Just kidding. It mainly consists of two proclamations that Akhenaten made, first when he founded Amarna, and then when he moved in. They mostly have to do with telling everyone how great the Aten is, in case they hadn't heard already. They mention plans for all the buildings he intended to construct there, including a house of the Aten, a mansion of the Aten, a sun temple for his wife Nefertiti, where she could worship the Aten, and a house of rejoicing for, you guessed it, the Aten. If you're like me, you're probably tired of lesser PDF editors. As someone who's working on fillable PDFs for a tabletop game, it's been challenging to find a program that won't scramble my work after a missed click. That's where the sponsor for today's video comes in, UPDF. UPDF is an innovative new PDF editor, combining industry standard tools for editing forms with tools such as adding text fields, signatures, and in my case, calculations, with powerful AI features as a bonus. It even appears that you can reference or even convert your document into an Excel file, which will be incredibly useful for me later on down the line. Other PDF programs tend to be glitchy. My wife can probably tell you how often she's heard me shouting obscenities while trying to create character sheets with other programs. But UPDF is smooth, it's well optimized on my machine, and still has all the functionality I've come to expect. I was even able to add a button onto the sheet so GMs can easily get the rulebook with one simple click. You can also easily add images to your documents. Now, I'll be the first to tell you that I don't use AI, but I can see how these features would be useful. The app supports GPT 4.0 and has a ton of features. For example, if I needed to quickly summarize a document for rehearsal or find the most difficult to pronounce words complete with pronunciation guides, I can do that. You can also translate a document into another language and can even chat with the PDF and get tips on how to use some of the more complex features of the program without needing to consult a tutorial or FAQ page. You can also transform your PDFs into a mind map, breaking down the concepts further. And of course, you can compress your PDF to smaller sizes and batch convert to other formats such as Excel, Word, and PowerPoint. Get this AI-powered UPDF editor with an exclusive discount now by clicking the link in the description and pinned comment. The offer covers one license that can be used on all platforms to edit and sync PDFs. Now back to the video. Also on the outskirts of Amarna were the tombs of the nobles, reserved for some of the prominent members of Akhenaten's royal retinue. These were found to the north and south of the city, carved into the cliffs and bluffs that bordered Amarna. They vary greatly in terms of size and grandeur, especially since some of them were still unfinished by the time Akhenaten died and Amarna was abandoned. In the north, we have 6 numbered tombs, all cut into the base of a steep cliff face that reaches up to 85 meters in height. These were richly decorated with reliefs of the royal family worshipping the Aten and belonged to the most important of Akhenaten's courtiers, which you could probably tell by their official titles. And by the way, I did look these up, and some of them I could not find pronunciations for, so I'm doing the best I can. In order, we have Huya, overseer of the royal harem and of the treasuries, and steward of the great royal wife T. Merira II, royal scribe, steward, overseer of the 2 treasuries, overseer of the royal harem of Nefertiti. Oms, true scribe of the king, fan-bearer on the king's right hand, steward of the estate of Akhenaten. Merira, high priest of the Aten in Akhenaten, fan-bearer on the right hand of the king. Bentu, royal scribe, first under the king, chief servitor of the Aten in the estate of the Aten in Akhenaten, chief of physicians, and Benesi, chief servitor of the Aten in the Temple of Aten in Akhenaten. Close to the northern tombs are the ruins of 3 desert altars built out of mud bricks in unique geometrical shapes. One was a small square with a deep hole in the middle, with 4 long ramps, one on each side. The middle altar consisted of 3 platforms, 2 small and 1 large, with the small ones flanking the ramp leading up to the large one. And the third structure was a small rectangular platform with 4 small ramps that had 1 or more columned rooms in the middle, surrounded by open colonnades. The purpose of the 3 altars has puzzled Egyptologists ever since they uncovered them almost a century ago. Does that mean it was aliens? No, it doesn't. However, if we take into account that they are placed by the road leading to the northern tombs and that the Aten's chief priests are buried there, it's not that much of a stretch to say that they were probably shrines or temples connected to the deity. If we move to the opposite side of Amarna, we find the South Tombs, which are definitely an example of quantity over quality, especially when comparing them to their northern counterparts. There are a lot more of them, and they are way less opulent. Most of them have little to no wall decorations, and some were only halfway done before work on them stopped. There are 19 numbered tombs here, although not all of them mention who they were meant for. Here we have a more eclectic collection of city officials who weren't in direct service of the Aten, such as Mahu, Amarna's chief of police, and Perenifer, a royal craftsman and the pharaoh's washer of hands. The most interesting name we find here is A, titled as God's father, fan-bearer on the right hand of the king, overseer of horses of his majesty, and yes, I probably butchered that pronunciation, I'm sorry. He later served as vizier to Tutankhamun before becoming a pharaoh in his own right for a few years during the waning days of the 18th dynasty. Priests, viziers, and royal scribes are all well and good, but we all know that when it comes to ancient Egyptian burial places, the tombs of the pharaohs are always the highlight. Unsurprisingly, Akhenaten reserved a special place for himself and his family. About halfway between the northern and southern tombs, there is a long river valley that bisects the cliffs east of Amarna. Deep in that valley is where the necropolis known as the Royal Wadi is located. There are 5 tombs here, 3 on the south side and 2 including the pharaohs on the north side. Unfortunately, as with many other things in Amarna, these are unfinished since Akhenaten's death also ended the Egyptian people's desire to see his vision fulfilled. At the very least, they had completed the pharaoh's burial chamber by the time Akhenaten had died. Of course, after he was gone, they plundered and desecrated his entire tomb, so most of that effort was in vain. As for the pharaoh's mummy, there were enough surviving fragments of his sarcophagus and Ushabti funeral figurines to suggest that he was indeed buried at Amarna when he died. His daughter, Meketaten, and possibly his mother, Ti, were there too. Even though the people considered him a heretic, they didn't just chuck him into a ditch or something like that, so when Amarna was abandoned, the remains were buried in the Valley of the Kings. We're done with the structures located on the outskirts of Amarna, but before we get to the city proper, there is an intermediate zone to pass through, where the villages of the workers were located. These settlements, simply known as the Workmen's Village and the Stone Village, were intentionally established on a low plateau away from Amarna so they would not be visible from the city. That way, the hoity-toity, or bougie residents of the capital didn't have to look at the common rabble who did all the actual work. The Workmen's Village was the main area where the commoners lived. It was a walled enclosure, and unsurprisingly, it was built on a tight budget, with thin walls and very little wood. 2 types of bricks were used in the construction of the houses, the regular mud bricks and ones made out of a clay and silt material called marl, which could be found in the hills around the village. This has led some Egyptologists to speculate that the ancient government initially provided the workers with bricks to build their homes, but when those ran out, they just told them to sort it out for themselves and that Aten doesn't like complainers. Therefore, the workers had to make do with whatever was handiest. The village contained around 80 houses, all alike in size and layout, about 10 meters long and 5 meters wide, split into 4 sections: the entrance hall, living room, bedroom, and kitchen. There was, however, one house that was bigger than the rest, which presumably belonged to the overseer, who got to brag to everyone about all that extra closet space he wasn't even using. The Stone Village is a bit more of a mystery. It's one of the least studied parts of Amarna, and only in recent times have there been more efforts to properly survey and excavate it. It's a little way south of the Workmen's Village, nestled in the same eastern-facing valley. Its name is derived from all the limestone boulders that are scattered over its rectangular surface, which measures approximately 80 by 65 meters. The stones are unworked, and even though many are gathered in linear patterns, it is hard to say with certainty if they were ever part of a housing structure or not. That's why calling the settlement a village might be a bit of a stretch, especially when you compare it to the nearby workman's village. If both were built at the same time for the same people, why was one clearly superior to the other? Taking this into account, scholars have put forward other ideas such as a military outpost, housing for slaves, or perhaps a temporary campsite for the men working in the nearby southern tombs. Now that we're done with all the tombs and the villages, it is finally time to properly enter the city of Amarna. For the sake of convenience, Egyptologists have divided it into multiple sectors, and so will we, starting with the northernmost area, the somewhat dully named North City. It was laid out in a triangular pattern wedged between the Nile River and the cliffs at the very northern end of Amarna. North City remains mostly unexcavated, but the parts that have been dug out have convinced scholars that this was once the swankiest place in Amarna, reserved strictly for the pharaoh and his most important courtiers. The city's main thoroughfare, dubbed the Royal Road, passed through the middle of the North City. On the side facing the river lay the ruins of a large palace, which was likely the main residence of Akhenaten and his family. Quite predictably, Egyptologists have named it the North Riverside Palace. Access to the palace was restricted by a thick brick double wall and a gateway. On the other side of the road, there were the ruins of several large houses, although understandably none of them were quite as grand as the pharaoh's home. Then, as you kept advancing towards the northern tip, the area became more utilitarian, filled with service buildings and storerooms. As we make our way down the Royal Road and head a bit south, we find the remnants of another palace in an isolated open space. This one is called the North Palace, not to be confused with the aforementioned North Riverside Palace. It had a monumental entrance marked by rows of columns that led into an inner court, flanked by two smaller entrances, and all three were lined with stone pavements. There was a throne room in the center of the structure, plus a bedroom and bathroom for the palace owner. The back of the palace served, once again, a functional purpose. There were storerooms, servants' quarters, kilns, cattle managers, and perhaps even a bakery. Egyptian donuts. The northeast corner was the one that excited archaeologists the most, as it was once home to a beautiful garden, and the walls surrounding it were once painted with a frieze depicting the natural life of the nearby marshes. Areas that still had visible painted plaster were recovered during the first excavations 100 years ago. As to the owner of the palace, several inscriptions indicate that it belonged to Princess Meritaten, the pharaoh's oldest daughter. However, those inscriptions visibly carved over an earlier name, which suggests that originally the North Palace belonged to someone else who either died or fell out of favor with Akhenaten, most likely one of his queens, Kia or Nefertiti. We end our trip uptown with a visit to the North Suburb, a large housing district that was split into two sections by a wadi, aka a river valley that drained floodwaters into the Nile. There were houses there for all budgets. Those on the west side were pretty closely packed together, while the prime real estate was on the edge of the wadi, where the houses were not only bigger but had multiple grain silos out front. This, as we all know, was the ancient Egyptian equivalent of parking a brand new convertible in the driveway for all the neighbors to see. The problem with the North Suburb was the same that plagued most of Amarna. The scale of its ambition outmatched the realities of what Akhenaten wanted to achieve. Parts of the suburb were still being constructed when the pharaoh died, and they were left unfinished as the former capital was abandoned and forgotten. The area in the middle of Amarna is simply known as Central City, and it served as both the administrative and spiritual center of the Egyptian capital. Here we had yet another palace, possibly the grandest one of all, hence its modern name, the Great Palace. The entrance was marked by columns and statues of the royal family and led into a massive courtyard, followed by a series of halls and chambers that surrounded a great court. Rows of apartments were located on two sides of the palace, and a 9-meter wide bridge connected the edifice to another structure scholars have dubbed the King's House. It also had a row of apartments plus an open court, storerooms, and decorated walls. It was obviously important since it was connected directly to the palace, but its true purpose still leaves Egyptologists stroking their chins in puzzlement. Rows of offices were dotted throughout the central city. This was where Amarna officials such as scribes and clerks plied their trade. Of particular note here was the Bureau of Correspondence of Pharaoh, basically an ancient records office. This was where Egyptologists recovered the Amarna letters, a series of correspondence between the pharaoh and officials in neighboring kingdoms. Curiously, they were all written in cuneiform and provided modern scholars with an unparalleled look into the world of ancient Egyptian diplomacy. But the palace and the offices are just the side dishes. The main course of Central City is represented by the temples dedicated to the Aten. After all, the whole point of Amarna was to worship the sun god, so unsurprisingly, the buildings dedicated to him were the most important. There are two of them here, the Great Temple and the Small Temple. The Great Temple of the Aten occupied an area roughly 800 by 300 meters in size, enclosed by a brick wall. However, most of that space was just flat open ground. A key characteristic of the temples dedicated to the Aten was that none of them had roofs. After all, why worship an image of the Aten when the god himself could cast his solar rays directly onto you? Another unique trait was that in all of the reliefs and decorations that filled the walls of Amarna, the Aten was never depicted as a humanoid figure like all the other Egyptian gods we're familiar with. It was always just the sun disk. There were, however, two stone structures inside. The Gempa Aten, aka the Long Temple, and the Sanctuary. The former was by far the larger of the two, and it consisted of a series of courtyards separated by monumental doorways, filled to the brim with offering tables. There were around 800 in total, so the people of Amarna could come, pray to the Aten, and present their tribute. By comparison, the Sanctuary was much smaller, but it was more of the same, filled with offering tables just in case the Long Temple got too crowded. The Small Temple, also known as the Mansion of the Aten, followed a similar plan, with several open courtyards and a sanctuary. Most likely, it was constructed first, and then Akhenaten realized that it simply wouldn't suffice for his ambitions and demanded a grander temple for his god. Going back onto the royal road, we travel to the third and final major area of Amarna, referred to by scholars as the main city. This was almost exclusively housing, stretching southward from Central City over a distance of 2.7 kilometers. The layout was similar to the north suburb, and even had a wadi that divided it into two sections. When they were excavated, some of the houses still had the name of the owner carved into limestone door frames. A special shout out goes to Thutmose the sculptor, since it was his workshop that Egyptologists found the iconic bust of Nefertiti, which has become undoubtedly one of the most famous works of art from ancient times. Further down south, the houses became larger and more spread out. This was the rich part of Main City, reserved for the wealthier citizens of Amarna, and Egyptologists distinguish it as the South Suburb. If we keep going south outside the city limits, there are a couple more structures we come across before reaching the boundary stelae. One of them, Meru Aten, was yet another temple, although this one seems to have been reserved for Merit Aten, the pharaoh's daughter. The other one, Kam El Nana, was a large brick enclosure divided into two uneven sections. Given that the north wall used to have a row of ovens and that bread molds were found on site, this was probably once a combined bakery and brewery to feed the people of Amarna. Curiously, it is also a rare instance where something new was constructed after Amarna was abandoned, as a Christian church was built over the ancient bakery sometime during the 5th or 6th century AD. And with that, we reach the end of the road, literally. As we said multiple times, Amarna was only around for a short while before turning into a ghost town, but one that left us with an amazing look into one of the key chapters in the story of Egypt, when one pharaoh decided to upend thousands of years of tradition and start fresh in a new location. It didn't work out, but we got some great Egyptology out of it, and for that, Amarna will always hold a special place in history. I hope you learned something today, and if you enjoyed today's video, be sure to deploy your likes, comment a historical figure we haven't covered, subscribe, and ring that bell, and share this video with someone who loves learning about historical figures. I'm Eric Malachite, and we'll see you next time.